Unit 11, Section 2, the Great Society. If you remember, in the 1930s, we had a president named Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and his domestic program was called the New Deal. The New Deal was supposed to help alleviate the pain and suffering of the Great Depression. In 1964, we see the election of Lyndon Baines Johnson, and he is the person that took the place of Kennedy upon his assassination in 1963. Lyndon Baines Johnson reads a book by a man named Michael Harrington. And in Michael Harrington's book, he points out that 1 out of every 5 Americans in the United States are living in poverty. Probably more importantly, 4 out of every 10 African Americans are living in poverty. Percentage-wise, that's 40% of minorities in our country are living in poverty. Johnson is not only surprised but upset by the fact that the richest country in the world has such a high poverty rate. And so he begins a program, a domestic program, that includes hundreds of smaller programs to help Americans and maybe redistribute income in our country to bring more people into the middle class. One particular program was in healthcare, and the program was known as Medicare. And Medicare there was a lot of elderly people in the United States who could not afford decent medical care, and this was a government program to make sure that they are provided with good health care options. Not just in healthcare, but also Johnson was the first president to start welfare programs. It was during his presidency that food stamps were started. It was during his presidency that more consumer protection types of laws and agencies were begun. But probably the most important contribution of the Lyndon Johnson's administration was in civil rights. In 1964, Johnson, through good legislative skills, was able to get past the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In this picture, you see Johnson handing the pen that he signed the legislation with to Martin Luther King. Many people credit Martin Luther King's speech in Washington, D.C., the I Have a Dream speech, along with the assassination of John F. Kennedy and the sympathy that followed for Kennedy. Johnson was able to get this legislation passed. What did this legislation do? It prohibited racial discrimination in all, and I say that with much gusto, all public places. During this semester, we've talked about the difference between de facto and de jure. If you'll remember that de jure means by law, and de facto means in reality. What I'm saying here is that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 began the process of really ending segregation in the South. The second civil rights legislation that you need to be aware of is the Voting Rights Act of 1965, actually shown here on this picture, signed by Johnson down at the bottom, Vice President up here in the middle. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 outlawed literacy tests. Literacy tests were used mostly in the South to limit African American participation in the voting process in the South. It also called for federal agents to be sent down into the South to stop intimidation by white Americans to try and keep minorities from participating in the election process. This is the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This concludes Unit 11, Section 2, the Great Society.